In her last decade, she went through her own personal papers, decades of them, and burned most of what she found. No public explanation, no interview about it. Her own family found out only after the fact how much was gone, and by then there was nothing left to recover. America knew her as the calm one, the wife in the plain coat, who shook 40,000 hands a campaign season and never once told a reporter what she actually thought about any of it. Her husband called her Pat on camera and something flatter in private, when he called her anything at all. She stood next to him through 2 elections he lost, a mob in South America that came close to killing them both, and a scandal that ended his presidency in public disgrace. And by the time she died in a house in New Jersey in June 1993, the fullest account of who she had actually been came from her own daughter, because the woman herself had spent 50 years making sure it wouldn't have to. Ask about 1973. It starts in 1912, in a mining town in Nevada, with a name her father picked before she'd done anything at all to earn it. Thelma Catherine Ryan was born on March 16, 1912, in Ely, Nevada, the daughter of a hard-luck silver miner named William Ryan and his second wife, Kate Halberstadt Bender. Her father called her Pat for St. Patrick's Day, which fell the following morning, and the nickname outlasted the birth name so completely that most of the country that later voted for her husband never once heard her real one. The family moved to a small truck farm in Artesia, California, when Pat was a toddler, and the labor started almost as soon as she could walk a row. She picked tomatoes and peppers before school. She helped can whatever the farm produced that couldn't be sold fresh. There was no money for anything beyond survival, and both her parents were already unwell in ways nobody in that house had the money or the habit of diagnosing out loud. Her mother, Kate, developed liver cancer and died in 1925. Pat was 13. She took over the household that day in every sense that mattered: cooking, cleaning, raising 2 younger brothers, while her father's health and his drinking both got steadily worse. William Ryan had silicosis, miner's lung, from years underground before the family farmed, and by the late 1920s, he could barely manage the land he depended on. Pat nursed him through the worst of it herself, dressing him, feeding him, doing the work a hired nurse would have done if there had been any money for one. He died in 1929. She was 17 years old, and she was now, functionally, an orphan running a household on nothing. Hold that fact carefully, because it explains more about the next 50 years than any speech she ever delivered. A girl who buries both parents by 17 and inherits nothing except 2 younger brothers to look after does not grow up believing anyone is coming to rescue her. She learns instead that composure is a survival skill, not a personality trait, and that the people around her who fall apart in public lose whatever ground they were standing on. Pat Ryan did not fall apart in public again. Not once, for the rest of her life, no matter what was thrown at her, and a great deal, over 5 decades, was thrown at her. She drove an elderly couple across the country to New York for a fee just to get out and see what else existed, worked briefly as a bank clerk, and took a job as an X-ray and laboratory technician at Seton Hospital in the Bronx, saving nearly everything she earned. She came back to California 2 years later, enrolled first at Fullerton Junior College and then transferred into the University of Southern California, and paid her own way through with a schedule that would exhaust most adults twice her age. Sales clerk at Bullock's Wilshire department store, telephone switchboard operator on the overnight shift, occasional film extra for a few dollars a day whenever a studio needed a crowd scene filled. She graduated in 1937 with a degree that qualified her to teach, one of a relatively small number of women in her graduating class to leave college with both a diploma and 0 debt owed to anyone. She took a teaching position at Whittier Union High School, in a small, conservative citrus town east of Los Angeles, instructing typing and shorthand, and by every account from people who knew her then, she was good at the job, well liked by her students, financially self-sufficient, and entirely unattached to any man. That changed in January 1938 at a tryout for a community theater production of a mystery play called The Dark Tower, staged by the Whittier Community Players. A young local lawyer named Richard Nixon showed up to read for a part. He was 25, ambitious, socially awkward in the specific way that later became a national punchline, and according to the account he gave for the rest of his life, he decided within the first conversation that he intended to marry her. He asked her out. She said yes to the date and no, repeatedly, to what came almost immediately after, because he proposed to her within weeks of meeting her, absurdly early, in a way she initially took for a joke. It wasn't. Watch what he did for the next 2 years, because it tells you something about the marriage before the marriage even started. Pat kept dating other men. Nixon, rather than backing off, offered to drive her to Los Angeles for those dates himself, and then wait outside to bring her home afterward, a detail she recounted decades later with what people close to her described as genuine, if slightly bewildered, affection. He wrote her letters that swung between formal, almost legal brief eloquence and near-total emotional exposure, telling her at one point in writing that he would simply wait as long as it took. In a different decade, from a different man, that pattern might have been read as a warning sign rather than devotion. Pat read it as devotion. By 1940, after 2 years of no, she said yes. They married on June 21, 1940, at the Mission Inn in Riverside, a small ceremony by any standard, nothing resembling the wedding a future president's wife might retroactively be expected to have had. There was no fortune behind either of them. Nixon was a small-town lawyer with a law degree from Duke and modest local prospects. She was a schoolteacher who had put herself through college entirely alone. What they had instead of money was an almost identical instinct for controlled effort, for outworking a problem rather than talking about it out loud. And that instinct, more than romance in any conventional sense, is the actual foundation this marriage was built on. Two people who had each independently concluded that hardship gets managed quietly, not discussed publicly, found each other and confirmed it. World War II arrived 18 months later and took Nixon almost entirely out of the house. He worked briefly for the Office of Price Administration in Washington, then enlisted in the Navy in 1942 and shipped out to the Pacific, running logistics for the South Pacific Combat Air Transport Command. Pat, meanwhile, took a government job analyzing wartime price and rationing data, first in San Francisco and later in Washington, supporting herself and effectively running her own independent life, while her husband spent stretches of over a year on the other side of the planet. She wrote to him constantly. The letters that survive are affectionate, practical, and almost entirely free of complaint, which either means she wasn't lonely, or means she had already decided, long before the marriage, that complaint simply wasn't a category of communication she used with the people she loved. Given everything that happened before 1929, the second explanation fits the woman a great deal better than the first. Nixon came home in 1946 and immediately ran for Congress in California's 12th district, recruited by a group of local businessmen looking for a young Republican who could unseat the Democratic incumbent, Jerry Voorhis. Pat did not spend this campaign in a receiving line somewhere. She did research, drafted speech material, managed the household with a newborn daughter, Tricia, born that February, and worked, functionally, as unpaid campaign staff on top of new motherhood. Nixon won. 4 years later, he ran for the Senate against the actress and Congresswoman Helen Gahagan Douglas, in a campaign that became one of the most notorious of the post-war era, built partly around so-called pink sheet material, implying Douglas's political sympathies leaned toward communism. Pat campaigned through the whole of it at his side, canvassing, organizing coffee mornings with local Republican women, and stood beside him at the victory podium when it worked. Whatever she privately thought about the tactics, and biographers have disagreed sharply for decades about how much she knew, how much she approved, and how much she simply chose not to look at too closely. She said nothing publicly then, and she said nothing publicly about it for the rest of her life. Nixon won that race too, and by 1952 he was young, telegenic, and controversial enough that Dwight Eisenhower's people put him on the presidential ticket as the vice presidential nominee. Look at what those two campaigns actually cost the household while they were winning. Between 1946 and 1950, Pat Nixon effectively ran 2 full-time jobs at once, wife and mother in a small home on one income, and unpaid senior campaign staffer on the other, with no separation between the two most days. Visitors to the house during the 1950 Senate race recalled finding her at the kitchen table at midnight, a baby asleep upstairs, sorting through opposition research on Helen Gahagan Douglas's voting record, by hand, because the campaign couldn't yet afford a research office of its own. She was, by the plainest possible description, doing the job a paid staffer would later do for every campaign her husband ever ran again, for exactly nothing, while raising 2 children, essentially alone, for months at a stretch. Nobody wrote that detail into the postcards the campaign printed of her. The postcards showed a smiling wife at a podium. They did not show the kitchen table. Here's what that decade of campaigning actually produced, and it's worth saying plainly, because it complicates the easy version of this story. It worked. Nixon's rise from a small-town lawyer to the vice presidency in 6 years is, by any measure, one of the fastest political ascents in modern American history, and Pat was not a bystander to it. She had run research desks, organized precinct captains, managed a household on a congressional salary, and absorbed one of the ugliest smear campaigns of the era without a single public complaint. The skill set she'd built surviving her own childhood, composure under pressure, total discretion, an ability to keep functioning while everything around her was on fire, turned out to be exactly the skill set a national campaign needed from the person standing next to the candidate. Nobody was drilling her the way Rose Kennedy drilled her children at the dinner table. Pat had drilled herself, alone, over a decade earlier, and by 1952, the results were on display in every hotel ballroom the campaign visited. What that decade did not produce was a version of the marriage where anyone asked her what she wanted out of it. Every major decision, to run in 1946, to run again in 1950, to accept the vice presidential nomination in 1952, arrived at the house already made, and her job was execution, not consultation. That's the hinge this entire period turns on. A woman who had spent her adolescence learning that nobody was coming to rescue her spent her 30s proving she didn't need rescuing, and the two lessons, layered on top of each other, produced a wife who could be handed almost any burden without complaint, which is precisely the kind of wife a rising political career runs on. That's when the marriage collided with its first real public crisis, and it is the moment that tells you the most about what Pat Nixon was actually being asked to give up. In September 1952, newspapers broke a story about a secret fund, roughly $18,000, raised by a small group of wealthy California backers to cover Nixon's political expenses. The implication was corruption, and the pressure inside the Eisenhower campaign to drop Nixon from the ticket became close to unbearable within a matter of days. Nixon's response was a nationally televised address on the evening of September 23, 1952, roughly 60 million Americans watching, in which he laid out his entire personal financial history in granular, almost humiliating detail: a life insurance policy, a mortgage, a 2-year-old Oldsmobile, and closed by admitting that his daughters had been given a small Cocker Spaniel named Checkers, a gift he wasn't going to give back no matter what anyone in the press said about it. Pat sat in the television studio that night, in view of the cameras for parts of the broadcast, present for the exact moment her husband stood in front of the entire country and said that his wife did not own a mink coat, only, in his words, a respectable Republican cloth coat. Sit with that sentence, because it is doing more than one thing at once. On the surface, it's a defense of frugality and honesty, and it worked exactly as intended. Telegrams and letters flooded the Republican National Committee in support, and Eisenhower kept Nixon on the ticket by the next morning. Underneath the surface, it is a man converting his wife's actual wardrobe into a live political exhibit on national television, without any record anywhere that he asked her first whether she wanted to be used that way. People who were present that night, and biographers working from their accounts since, describe Pat as devastated by the broadcast even as it succeeded, furious, by several accounts, at the exposure of financial and personal details she considered strictly private, and reportedly telling friends in the weeks afterward that she wanted him out of politics for good. He did not get out of politics. The speech is remembered today as one of the great rescues in American television history. What it cost the marriage is remembered by almost nobody. largely because the one person who could have told that part of the story made sure it never got told. The vice presidency brought travel, and travel brought the second defining crisis. In May 1958, Nixon and Pat took a goodwill tour through South America, and in Caracas, Venezuela, their motorcade drove directly into an ambush. A mob surrounded the cars, smashed the windows, spat through the broken glass at both of them, rocked the vehicle hard enough that military and Secret Service escorts had to physically fight a path out before it could be overturned. Pat was in the car for all of it, glass on the seat beside her. She did not scream and did not visibly panic, and according to Secret Service accounts recorded afterward, she spent much of the ride reassuring the people around her, rather than the other way around. The American press loved the story that resulted from it. The composed vice president's wife, who didn't flinch while a foreign mob tried to kill her. What that story conveniently left out is the obvious question nobody in 1958 was in the habit of asking a political wife out loud: what it actually does to a person to survive something like that, and then be expected to smile for photographers at the airport the next morning, on schedule, on time, as advertised. There is no record of an answer, because there is no record of anyone ever putting the question to her directly. 2 years later, Nixon lost the presidency to John Kennedy by a margin so narrow that arguments over the outcome continued in some circles for years afterward. 2 years after that, in 1962, he ran for governor of California against the incumbent Pat Brown, and lost that race too, decisively this time. By multiple independent accounts from people close to the family, Pat Nixon did not want him to run for governor at all. She had already watched one national loss up close. She reportedly told friends, more than once, that what she actually wanted was a normal life, a house that didn't run on a campaign calendar, children who could finish a school year in the same building they'd started it in. He ran anyway. He lost, badly, and the morning after, in what became known ever since as his last press conference, he delivered a bitter, rambling statement to reporters that closed with the now famous line that they wouldn't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Reporters in the room that day recalled Pat standing nearby visibly in tears, one of the only times in 3 decades of public life that anyone caught her crying anywhere a camera could plausibly have seen it. Keep that image, because it recurs, in a very different register, 12 years later, in the East Room of the White House. Weigh that press conference carefully, because it is the closest thing this marriage has to a clean, undisputed data point. There is no ambiguity in the record about who wanted to stop running and who wanted to keep going. She wanted to stop. He decided anyway, ran, lost publicly and badly, and then stood in front of a room full of reporters and turned his own political obituary into a speech about the press's treatment of him, rather than a reckoning with what the loss had cost the people standing behind him. She was one of those people. She cried where cameras could see her for one of the only times in 3 decades, and the speech is remembered today, when it's remembered at all, as an eccentric footnote in Nixon's biography, rather than as the moment his wife's patience finally, visibly, ran out. She got, briefly, something close to what she had asked for. The family moved to New York. Nixon joined a Wall Street law firm, and the years between 1963 and 1967 are the closest thing to an ordinary domestic life this marriage ever produced in nearly 3 decades together. Regular family dinners at a fixed hour, a settled apartment instead of a rented headquarters house. 2 daughters, Tricia and Julie, growing up for a few consecutive years without a campaign schedule dictating the calendar. Several biographers, working from entirely separate sources and with no particular incentive to agree with each other, independently describe this stretch as the happiest period Pat Nixon experienced as an adult, which is its own kind of verdict on every year that came before and after it. It lasted 4 years. In 1968, against the advice of some in his own circle, who worried a 3rd national campaign would be one too many, Nixon decided to run for president again. Pat, whatever she had told friends in 1962 about wanting out permanently, campaigned for him with the same total, uncomplaining effort she had brought to every race since 1946, crossing the country on the same tightly scheduled circuit of teas, rallies, and local television interviews, that had defined every previous decade of their marriage. He won, narrowly, and in January 1969, she became First Lady of the United States, at 56 years old, having spent essentially the entirety of her adult life either building or repairing her husband's political career. She was about to spend the next 5.5 years doing both simultaneously, in public, under a level of scrutiny neither of them had ever faced before, with almost none of the credit. Look at what she actually did with the position once she had it, because the record here is more substantial than the nickname ever allowed for. She pushed the White House to stay open later and to more visitors than any previous administration had managed, expanded the volunteer programs she'd championed since the 1968 campaign into a formal national initiative encouraging ordinary Americans to give time rather than money to causes they cared about, and personally approved a wave of acquisitions for the White House's permanent art and furniture collection, working directly with curators on pieces most visitors to this day walk past, without knowing whose judgment put them there. In 1972, she traveled with her husband to China, on the trip that reopened American relations with Beijing after more than 2 decades of silence, and the photographs of her touring communes and hospitals went out across the world's press within hours. A kind of diplomatic exposure no previous First Lady had experienced at that scale. None of it moved the nickname. The nickname had already been assigned in 1970, before most of this happened, and nicknames in American politics, once assigned, tend to outlive the facts that were supposed to justify them. The press in those years settled on a nickname for her that stuck for the remainder of her life, and, arguably, for the way history has remembered her ever since: Plastic Pat. The theory behind it was that her composure, the exact same composure that had carried her through an orphaned adolescence, a mob in Caracas, and a live television confession about her own coat, read on camera as manufactured, robotic, hollow, a smile with nothing behind it. People who actually worked alongside her inside the White House residence described someone close to the opposite: funny in private, sharply observant, blunt with staff when she needed to be, and the driving force behind a genuine expansion of public access to the White House, including the first lighting installed specifically for evening tours and the first tactile exhibits designed so blind visitors could experience the art and furnishings by touch. None of that made it into the nickname. The nickname was built entirely around a face that refused to crack on command, and by 1970, that face was already carrying considerably more than the reporters assigning the label understood. In May 1970, a catastrophic earthquake in Peru killed tens of thousands of people, and Pat Nixon flew there herself to deliver relief supplies and comfort survivors, becoming the first American First Lady in history to travel abroad entirely alone on an official humanitarian mission representing a sitting president. She toured devastated villages, sat with families who had lost everything, and completed the entire trip without her husband present for a single minute of it, at 58 years old, roughly a decade after surviving a mob that had tried to overturn her car in the same part of the world. Read that trip against the cloth coat line from 1952. The country had spent 18 years being told, in exhaustive detail, exactly what kind of coat Pat Nixon wore, and exactly how little it cost. It rarely stopped to ask what kind of woman got on a government plane, completely alone, and flew toward earthquake rubble on the other side of the hemisphere, because the job in front of her needed doing, and nobody else was available to do it. Then came Watergate, and this is where the marriage stops being a story about political sacrifice, absorbed with grace, and becomes something considerably harder to defend on anyone's behalf. The break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters happened in June 1972. The unraveling took 2 years, moving through a Senate investigation, the Saturday Night Massacre in October 1973, the slow release of the White House tapes, and a mounting impeachment inquiry that consumed the final 18 months of the presidency almost entirely. Through nearly all of it, according to multiple biographers working independently from separate sources, Pat Nixon was kept substantially in the dark by her own husband and the small circle of aides around him. She reportedly learned major developments: the firing of the special prosecutor, the existence of specific tapes, the contents of conversations that would eventually end the presidency, from television broadcasts at roughly the same moment the rest of the country did. Her daughters, Julie and Tricia, both became visible, vocal public defenders of the administration during the crisis, appearing repeatedly on television and in print far more actively than their mother did, which by itself is worth sitting with. The family's single most experienced political operator, a woman who had run congressional research, worked crowds for 3 decades, and survived an actual attempted lynching in Caracas, was by 1973 and 1974 largely sidelined from her own family's defense of itself during the worst crisis it had ever faced. There's a specific story from this period that biographers keep returning to, because it captures the dynamic better than any summary could. During the final Christmas the family spent in the White House, in December 1973, with the impeachment inquiry already gathering momentum in the House Judiciary Committee. Staff who were present recalled Pat directing the holiday preparations with the same exacting attention she'd brought to every official function for 5 years. The same tree, the same choir, the same schedule of receptions, while her husband spent long stretches of those same days locked away with lawyers reviewing subpoenaed material she had not been shown. 2 households' worth of labor were happening under a single roof that December. One visible, cheerful, and entirely hers to manage. One invisible, legal, and entirely his to survive. Neither woman nor husband, by every account available, ever really discussed the other one's version of that Christmas with the other. Treat the private accounts of exactly how much she knew and when carefully, because almost all of them come from people with a reason to shape the story one way or the other. Loyal aides protecting the president's reputation, disaffected staff settling old scores, family members protecting their mother's memory. But one detail keeps surfacing across nearly every version, regardless of who's telling it. Nobody, on either side of that argument, claims she was in the room for the decisions that mattered. The debate is only ever about how much she was told afterward, never about whether she was consulted before. Lester David, an independent biographer who published The Lonely Lady of San Clemente in 1978, 4 years after the resignation, described a marriage that by that final year had drifted into something close to 2 separate lives, conducted under one roof. 2 people who had spent 30 years managing crisis after crisis, side by side, and had, by the end, stopped managing this particular one together at all. The family disputed the portrait sharply and publicly at the time. That dispute is worth taking seriously, the way any contested account is worth taking seriously when it's challenged by the people it directly concerns. But the underlying facts nobody seriously disputes are damning enough entirely on their own terms. She was not consulted on the major decisions. She was not fully briefed on the legal exposure. The woman who had helped build this career from a folding table doing opposition research in 1946 was, by the summer of 1974, watching its collapse from roughly the same distance as a stranger with a newspaper subscription and a television set. On August 8, 1974, Nixon addressed the nation and announced he would resign the presidency effective the following day. The only American president in the country's history to do so. The next morning, in the East Room, he delivered a long, rambling, emotional farewell address to his assembled staff, at points nearly losing his composure entirely on camera for the first time most Americans had ever seen. Pat stood beside him for the whole of it, visibly composed, and did not speak. Not one word, on the single day the career she had spent her entire adult life subordinating herself to finally, completely, and publicly collapsed. They walked out together afterward to the helicopter waiting on the South Lawn, and it lifted off, and the presidency was finished. They retreated first to San Clemente, then to a New York apartment, and finally, in 1981, to a modest house in Saddle River, New Jersey, chasing something like the quiet life she'd said she wanted back in 1962, 20 years too late for it to arrive on her own terms. It did not come cheap, physically. Pat suffered a stroke on July 7, 1976, less than 2 years after the resignation, and though she recovered enough function afterward to resume a version of normal life, a second stroke followed, in 1983, and left her permanently more fragile than before. She had smoked heavily since young adulthood, a habit almost nobody around her in the White House years apparently thought worth mentioning to a country that was busy calling her plastic instead. And in early 1993, doctors diagnosed a fast-moving lung cancer that had already spread. In her final weeks, according to the accounts her daughters gave afterward, she was characteristically uninterested in discussing the diagnosis at length, more concerned with whether the household around her was running smoothly than with her own prognosis, a final, almost reflexive return to the same instinct she'd built at 17, in a farmhouse with a dying father and no money. Manage what's in front of you, and don't make the people around you carry your fear on top of their own. She died at home in Park Ridge, New Jersey, on June 22, 1993. It was one day after her 53rd wedding anniversary. Richard Nixon, a man famous across 5 decades of public life for a level of emotional control that occasionally verged on the pathological, wept openly at her funeral, in front of cameras, in a way that reportedly stunned people who had known him closely for 30 years and had genuinely never once seen him do it before. He died less than 10 months later, in April 1994, from a stroke. Whatever the marriage actually was, underneath 53 years of cloth coats, campaign smiles, and silences he'd repeatedly asked her to keep on his behalf, it apparently held together enough, in the end, that losing her broke something in him that Watergate itself never quite managed to. Now look at who got to decide, afterward, what the marriage had actually been. In 1986, their daughter Julie Nixon Eisenhower published Pat Nixon, The Untold Story, warm, detailed, and drawn heavily from family papers and her mother's own recollections. A portrait of a devoted wife and mother who weathered every political storm thrown at her with grace and quiet strength. It remains the book most Americans who know anything at all about Pat Nixon have actually read, if they've read one at all, and it functions in almost exactly the way Rose Kennedy's own memoir functioned for the Kennedys a decade earlier. An authorized family version that became the default public account through sheer force of access, affection, and timing. Lester David's independent, unauthorized biography, the one describing a marriage curdled by decades of isolation and Watergate-era silence, never achieved anything close to the same reach, and the family's public discomfort with it was well documented at the time it was published. It took until 2011, nearly 2 decades after Pat Nixon's own death, for a fuller scholarly reassessment, Mary Brennan's Pat Nixon, Embattled First Lady, to work carefully through the archival material held at the Nixon Presidential Library without either family sign-off or an axe to grind, and even that more balanced account remains, in most people's minds, a footnote sitting quietly next to the daughter's version. Go back to the burned papers. For decades, Pat Nixon was praised, over and over, for her discretion, her poise, her total refusal to ever say a critical word about her husband or her marriage in public, and it was treated, the same way Rose Kennedy's index cards were once treated, as straightforward proof of devotion. Here is the part that rarely gets said plainly. A woman orphaned at 17 learns early, out of pure necessity, that the story you keep tight control over is the one asset nobody can ever repossess from you. She built an entire adult life on managing catastrophe after catastrophe without ever once describing it out loud. From her father's death in a farmhouse in 1929, straight through a mob attack in Caracas and a national resignation address she wasn't invited to help write. And then, near the very end, she sat down and went through the private record of that whole life herself, decades of letters and diaries, and made certain that most of it would never exist for anyone else to manage on her behalf. She did not hate her husband. There is no evidence anywhere in the surviving record that supports that word, and it would be a cheap, cartoonish reading of a genuinely complicated 53 years. What she did, instead, was subordinate herself, over and over and over, across 5 decades, to a career that consistently asked more of her than it ever gave back. From a cloth coat converted into a national television exhibit, to a resignation speech she stood beside without being asked to help shape a single sentence of it. And then, when he was finally gone too, she left almost nothing behind to argue with the version her own family ultimately chose to tell the world about who she had actually been. Richard Nixon has a presidential library with his name carved across the front of it, built in large part to defend a presidency that nearly destroyed them both. His wife spent her final years quietly making sure there would be almost nothing left inside it, or anywhere else, that was actually, unmistakably hers.